Hey, how you doing? Daniel Ruiz Tyson with another Writer's Life. It's Saturday, a quiet Saturday. My routine is pretty much the same every Saturday. I get up early, jump in the shower, and then go across the road to get the paper for the neighbour. Always go first thing in the morning. It's the Daily Mail I have to get, and it runs out quickly in this particular shop. I'm not going to be leaving the flats later in the morning to go walk into the next shop to look for that kind of paper. So that's my routine set. Then I come back, have a coffee, have breakfast, do a bit of work. Then I usually, because I'm such a bad sleeper, one of the things I try to avoid always is the afternoon nap because I've found in the past that the afternoon nap is deadly. It's actually the one time of day when I can fall into a deep sleep, and I just think it's a waste of a day. But Saturday mornings in recent months, because my hours are ridiculous during the week, and because I'm such a bad sleeper, I'll just go to bed. I've got a couple of books on the go at the minute, and I know that after 20, 30 pages, I might start drifting off. So then I listen to a podcast. I'll get 10 minutes into the podcast and then I fall asleep. Today that was not possible. I don't know what was going on. It was around 10:30. Yeah, about 10:30. I don't know if it was a delivery. I know that new people have moved in to the flat on the next floor down that's privately rented. Fell into the hands of a buy-to-let landlord a few years ago, and since then, every 6 months or so, we get new tenants coming in into the building, and so maybe it was maybe they were moving more stuff in, but the noise on the stairs, the communal hallway stairs, was just relentless, and I just couldn't doze off, and it went on for the best part of an hour, and it is the problem with living in flats. We live in a country where the housing stock is appalling. We have the smallest flats in Western Europe. We have an obesity crisis as well in this country. So I don't know how it's going to work when people are, tending to be bigger than ever, and we've got the smallest flats in Western Europe to accommodate them. And what we have is got a lot of housing stock that really, back in the day, to use an Americanism, were houses, and they've been converted to flats, poorly converted. They're the worst kind of buildings to live in. And I grew up in one of those. So I've always prided myself on being very quiet. My dad was always on at me and my sister to be really quiet, to respect your neighbours. I knew, because we lived there for 24 years, I knew where every little creak in the floor was, and there were plenty. And since then, somewhat crazily, I must have lived in over 30 places in the last, few years. It's the way, it's the way London is. When the housing crisis, when the media cottoned onto it, I kind of thought it's about time, because I was talking about this in the early noughties. I've always privately rented. We never, as a family, my family never had council accommodation, so we never lived in purpose-built flats, which I think are the best flats to live in. And when I started renting privately on my own, realizing what I had to pay, I just thought, how come nobody else is talking about this? And certainly in my world, my friends, my working class friends, they weren't talking about it because they were either living in council houses, council flats, or they were still living at home in houses that their parents had bought off the council, or they'd bought their houses with a big helping hand from their parents. So no one quite knew what I was talking about. But I think in the late noughties, once different chunks of this country's population started to get caught up in the housing crisis, when people were no longer able to buy, when young people started moving into flats, renting privately, when where once they might have expected to buy, that all changed. The middle class have a voice. They used it well. They brought the issue to the attention of the people who could do something about it, or at least publicise it like the media. But it was about 10 years too late, I would argue, and I would also argue that in the last few years not too much has changed. The emphasis still seems to be on young people rather than... I don't think the media can get their head around the fact that there's a lot of older private renters out there, people like me who never wanted to buy. You know, the only reason I would want to buy is because, you know, I would like to get rid of landlords. I would like them out of my life. I've never liked them. And that would be the only motivation. I would buy a house or a flat and I would live in it. I wouldn't be concerned about how much the property is worth, how much I can make by selling it. I wouldn't be interested in buying a second property. For me, you know, if you're going to buy a house, fine. Buy your house, live in it, build your memories, shut up. Don't talk about the value. Live your life. We're here for a very short time. Assuming I'm not going to live forever. Anyway, this has gone off in a completely different direction to what I wanted to talk about. I think, I mean, I'm not big on apps. I don't have many apps on my phone. I think the bus app is the main one, and that doesn't really work properly, the TfL app. I think that, you know, we live in an age where so much stuff is delivered, and it's great that, you know, the elderly now have the option to order their shopping online, spares them the visual of the shopping trolley, you know, in the final years of their life. But these delivery drivers, you know, they just walk into a place, any building, the same, you know, like they're walking into a house. I just saw the phone trembling there as I'm filming this. I'm kind of wondering if this is the early signs of Parkinson's. I just think my hands find it difficult to hold this phone for much longer. I really do need to get a selfie stick. I don't think I'm going to be able to swap arms here. It's going to be too awkward. Yeah, they just come blitzing up the stairs. I think it would be great if there was a phone app that delivery drivers would punch in the address. It would tell the delivery drivers how old the property is, when it was built, not necessarily the people that are living in that property, but how many households are there, whether it's whether we're looking at converted flats, whether it's a purpose-built flats, flats, what kind of carpeting is in the communal hallway. Is it thick carpet? You know, if it's a thin carpet, you know, it's going to be loud in there. You know, do these delivery drivers, do they not go on work, on workshops? Are they not taught how to walk in buildings? I know sometimes they're carrying a considerable amount of weight. It may not make walking quietly possible, but I think it's something that they should be aware of. I was always able to tell the difference, and continue to be able to tell the difference between people that grew up in flats and people that grew up in houses. And I've lived in a couple of houses with friends, having grown up in a flat. And, you know, I have one friend who always joked about how quiet I was, that he never knew when I was in or not. And that's because of how I grew up. You know, respecting my neighbours, being very quiet. If not, my dad was on my case, as he should have been. Now, my friend, after living in his 4-bed house, purpose-built house for 30 years, then ended up moving into a smaller flat, purpose-built. But I remember a few years ago saying to me that he finally realised why I was like I was, why I was as quiet as I was, because living in flats is completely different to living in houses. So you can always tell people that have grown up in houses, they're far more relaxed, which is not a bad thing. You know, they're slamming doors, they're racing upstairs. You can't do that in flats. And, you know, we're living in an era now where people are just increasingly selfish. You know, I'm sounding like an old man here, but do you need stereo surround sound? I remember first experiencing this in 2003. I was living in North London and I had no idea what stereo surround sound was. I was living in a studio flat and someone next door was watching films really loud or playing a video game, whatever it was. It's hard to tell sometimes. That was my first experience of stereo surround sound. Now, unless I lived in a house, it was a detached house, I don't need to watch something that loud. If I want to go to the cinema, which I don't, as I told you a few nights ago, you know, I will go to the cinema. You don't need stereo surround sound. You've got neighbours, you know, show them some respect. I just think it would be, you know, it would not be a bad idea to have an app that gives you the building's history, how many households are in it, how well furnished the communal hallways are, how many flights of stairs, how narrow the staircases are, maybe what the average age of the residents are. And it's kind of hard now to build a relationship up with neighbours because obviously this is the age of, private renting. It's taken over. So you don't really get to know your neighbours unless you've been somewhere for a while. As I say, the flat downstairs, since it, fell into this landlord's hands, has had about 3 or 4 different tenants now in about 3 years. You don't get to know them, so if there's a problem with them, you're not able to build up a kind of relationship with them where you can get the problem sorted. They're gone, the next people come, they might be worse, they might be better. So, if you're living in a flat, if you've never lived in a flat before, just be mindful of your neighbours. If you're having a conversation in the communal hallway, is it necessary to have that conversation in the communal hallway? Can that conversation not happen in the flat? Can you not understand that people, if you're living in a place like this place where there's 7 or 8 flats, that people are going to be picking up on what you're talking about? So there's a lot to consider, and I'm not living in a purpose-built flat, so you hear pretty much everything in this place, and sometimes it can be difficult. I remember a place I was living in about a decade ago. It was my huge misfortune that about 7, 8 months into the tenancy, a new guy moved in upstairs who kept really strange hours, and it later turned out he was a peer, so he was coming from the House of Lords late every night. I couldn't get to sleep until after he'd urinated when he got in. It was always, and I'm looking here into the top left-hand corner of this particular room, his bowl must have been at that end of the room, and he wouldn't hit the sides. It was gone midnight. He wasn't hitting the sides with his urine. He was just going straight into the water, blasting it out. When he moved in, he was doing DIY after midnight. I kid you not. And I'm a very tolerant guy. I've got a very long temper. It was raining heavily that night. I stepped out of the flat, went up to confront them. They were making so much noise they couldn't hear me at the door. I went out into the rain and just continued to press the buzzer, and eventually was again, I don't think they heard the bell, so I went up again and kept banging, and then finally a guy who looked like Bernie Ecclestone, the old Formula One impresario, answered the door, and I basically demanded to know what was going on. I said I lived downstairs, this and that. I'd never had this confrontation before with any neighbour anywhere I'd lived. And he said he would do his best to keep the noise down, asked who I was, which I thought was, asked for specifics, so I thought that was a bit odd. And turned out he was actually the landlord. His business in Morocco had gone tits up. This was during the early days of the recession, so he'd come back to the building which he owned, and he was going to be living there. And, by the end of that tenancy, I was on sleeping pills. It was... I couldn't bring anyone back to the place, not with the urinating going on at midnight. On the odd occasion I did bring someone back. I'd made sure we stayed in the front room before moving into the bedroom until I knew for certain that Bernie Ecclestone had finished his urinating that he did every night as soon as he got home. So look, it's quiet enjoyment. If you live in a flat, if you've moved into a flat, if your background is if you grew up in a house, just be aware of that. Flats are different. It's a completely different world, and I didn't get my nap this morning. Maybe that's connected to the camera wobble. Enjoy your evening. Subscribe if you like this. Look after yourself.